The morning August Wilcox rode back into Caldwell, Kansas, with 6 silver medals pinned to his chest and a letter from the governor folded in his breast pocket. Every soul in town came out to the boardwalk to watch, and not a single one of them knew that behind those pale gray eyes lived a man so hollowed out by loneliness that the medals felt more like shackles than honors. It was the spring of 1882, and Caldwell sat at the edge of everything. The last real town before the Cherokee Strip opened up into cattle country that seemed to stretch all the way to the end of the earth. The Santa Fe Railway had come through 2 years prior, and with it came the drovers, the gamblers, the speculators, and the kind of ambition that smelled faintly of horse sweat and whiskey. Caldwell called itself the Queen of the Border, and in that particular season, it wore the title with the swagger of a man who hadn't yet been told his luck was running out. August Wilcox was 32 years old, and he was, by any measure a person might apply, the most decorated man in the county. He had served as deputy marshal under Henry Brown the previous year, distinguishing himself twice during cattle disputes that had nearly turned to open bloodshed. He had helped negotiate the safe return of a rancher's son who'd been taken by a group of desperate drifters out of Indian Territory. He had single-handedly extinguished a fire on the eastern edge of town that had threatened to swallow the grain warehouse and 4 homes alongside it. The governor had written to commend him personally. The town council had given him a silver plaque. The newspaper in Wichita had printed his name beside words like valor and honor, and a Methodist minister had once compared him, not entirely quietly, to the Archangel Michael, though August had thought that particular comparison was the most absurd thing he had ever heard in his life. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with hair the dark brown of river-soaked timber, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved with purpose. He moved through town with a measured stride that people noticed but couldn't quite name, not arrogance, but something quieter and more complicated. Like a man who had learned very early that most rooms were not built for the kind of weight he carried inside him. He lived alone in a house on the northern edge of town. The house was neat, well-maintained, and utterly devoid of softness. No curtains on the front windows, no flowers in the yard. The kitchen table seated 4 but had never held more than 1 plate at a time. He rose before dawn and was working before the town stirred, and he stayed out late enough that by the time he came home the streets were empty, and no one had to see him standing in the doorway of his own house with that expression on his face. The one that looked, if you caught it at the right angle, like a man quietly waiting for something he had almost stopped believing would come. His mother had died when he was 14. His father had sold the farm in Missouri and come west, chasing the cattle money, and had died of a fever outside Dodge City when August was 19. He had one brother, Elias, 3 years younger, who had gone to California and written 3 letters in as many years, each one more distantly cheerful than the last, like postcards from a life that was moving steadily further away. August had answered every one. The women of Caldwell had tried, of course. Mrs. Peterson, who ran the dry goods store, had paraded her niece through twice. The banker's daughter had smiled at him from under her parasol so many times that it had become a kind of town joke. He had been respectful and courteous and entirely unmoved, and slowly, over the course of 2 years, the matchmaking efforts had subsided into a respectful sort of resignation. People decided he was simply the type of man who was married to his duty, and they filed that conclusion away and moved on. What they did not know, what August had never told anyone, was that the loneliness had weight and texture and smell, the way winter air has weight and texture and smell, and that he had learned to live inside it, the way a man learns to live inside a season he cannot change. He had stopped fighting it sometime around his 28th year, and now it was simply part of him, like the scar on his left forearm from a barbed wire fence and the permanent crease between his brows that made him look more serious than he perhaps intended. He had accepted it. That was the part he could not have explained to anyone, not with defeat, but with a kind of quiet resignation that had hardened slowly into something resembling peace. He told himself it was enough, the work, the duty, the small, dignified life he had built. He told himself this almost every morning. He almost believed it. The wagon rolled into Caldwell on a Tuesday morning in late April, 3 weeks after August had returned from the governor's reception in Topeka. It was not a remarkable wagon in any way that would have drawn a second glance under normal circumstances. A single-horse rig, a little weathered, loaded with a trunk, 2 canvas sacks, a crate of tools, and something that turned out to be a rolled-up length of good-quality leather. The horse was a sturdy chestnut mare with more sense than flash, and she navigated Main Street with the calm authority of an animal that had seen considerably worse roads than this one. The woman driving her was Nora Talbot, and she drove the way she did everything with her full attention and without any particular concern for how it looked. She was 26, and she had been traveling for 11 days from a homestead outside of Liberal, Kansas, where her father had farmed and then died and left her a small amount of cash, a good horse, a crate of leatherworking tools, and absolutely nothing else to stay for. She had brown hair that was pinned up but losing the argument against the wind, dark hazel eyes that shifted between green and gold depending on the light and her mood, and a face that was honest in the way that faces are honest when their owner has long since stopped having the time or inclination to be otherwise. She wore a practical blue dress that had been washed so many times it had softened to the color of early morning sky, and her boots, the boots that half of Caldwell would later remember as the first notable thing about her, were dusty with the red-brown grit of the trail, the kind of dirt that settles in deep and doesn't shake loose without real effort. She pulled the mare to a stop in front of the sheriff's office, consulted a folded letter in her coat pocket, looked up at the sign above the door, and stepped down from the wagon with the ease of someone who had been climbing in and out of wagons their whole life. She didn't look around to see if anyone was watching. She didn't smooth her skirt or check the state of her hair. She tucked the letter back into her pocket, patted the mare once on the neck, and walked straight through the door of the sheriff's office. August was inside, writing a report at the desk, when the door opened and brought with it the smell of trail dust and spring wind and something faintly like cedar, which was the soap Nora used when she could get it. He looked up. She looked at him with the directness of someone who has been traveling alone for nearly 2 weeks and has very little patience left for anything that isn't what it appears to be. "I'm looking for a Marshal August Wilcox," she said. "I was told he might be here." "Deputy Marshal," he said, standing. He was not sure why he felt the need to correct the title, only that accuracy was a habit he'd never managed to break. "That's me." She studied him for a moment in the way that people study things they are deciding whether to trust. Then she pulled out the letter and handed it across the desk. "My name is Nora Talbot. I've come to set up a leather goods business in Caldwell. I have a reference letter from the county clerk in Meade. I was told I needed to register with the marshal's office and that you could direct me to available commercial space." August took the letter and read it carefully. It was, as she had described, a straightforward letter of reference, noting that Miss Talbot was of good character, had operated a small saddle repair business out of her father's homestead for 4 years, and was known to be reliable and skilled at her trade. "Your business was in Meade County?" he asked. "Outside Liberal," she said. "My father's farm. After he passed, there wasn't enough to keep me there, and there wasn't enough business in Liberal for a dedicated leather shop. Caldwell sees more traffic." "That it does," he agreed. He set the letter down and looked at her, not in the way that made women uncomfortable, but with the same careful attention he gave everything, the way a man looks at something he is trying to understand. "You came alone." "I did. 11 days on the trail, 12 counting today." He said nothing for a moment. Outside, a wagon rattled past on Main Street, and the sound of men's voices drifted in from somewhere down toward the stockyards. "There's a commercial space on the corner of Kishom and 5th, he said finally. "It was a harness shop until last fall. It's been empty since, You'd need to speak to Frank Hargrove at the land office about the lease. Is he honest? August considered this. He's not dishonest, he said. He'll try to rent it to you at a higher rate than he'd offer a man. Tell him you know what the Hendersons paid for the space next door, and that you'll be speaking to the county assessor's office if the rates don't match. Nora looked at him with a faint expression that wasn't quite a smile but was adjacent to one. That's more useful than I expected. What did you expect? To be told it wasn't a good idea for a woman to be running a business alone in a cattle town. It isn't, he said honestly. But that's true in most places, and it doesn't seem to have stopped you. She studied him again. Then she did smile, small, genuine, the kind of smile that hadn't been rehearsed. No, she said, it doesn't. She took back the reference letter, thanked him with a brisk efficiency that suggested she had more things to accomplish before nightfall, and walked back out through the door. August stood at the desk for a moment after she left, looking at the door, and then looked back down at his report. He picked up his pen. He set it down again. He went to the window and watched her unhitch the mare and lead her toward the livery stable, the mare walking with that same calm authority she'd arrived with, Nora Talbot moving alongside her with the easy stride of someone who has spent most of her life outdoors. The red-brown dirt on her boots caught the mid-morning light as she walked. He picked up his pen again and tried to remember what he had been writing about. The harness shop became Talbot Leather Goods inside of 2 weeks, and the speed at which Nora got it operational was the first thing that made people pay attention to her. She scrubbed the place out herself, rehung the door that had been sagging on its hinges, replaced 2 windows, arranged her tools with a precision that her few early customers found slightly intimidating, and opened for business on a Monday morning with a handwritten sign in the window that said simply, "Saddles, bridles, belts, and repairs, custom work available." The cattlemen were skeptical at first in the way that cattlemen are skeptical of anything new, which is to say completely and openly, and without any particular embarrassment about it. But a rancher named Willis Drummond came in on the second day with a saddle that had been giving him trouble for months, and Nora assessed it in about 4 minutes, told him exactly what was wrong, quoted him a price, and had it ready by Friday morning. He rode out of town on Saturday afternoon sitting on that saddle with the expression of a man who has been handed back something he thought was gone for good, and by Monday the following week, there were 3 more men waiting outside Talbot Leather Goods before she had even opened the door. August noticed all of this from the measured distance that constituted his life. He passed the shop on his morning rounds. He noted the growing list of horses tied outside. He observed, with the professional interest of a man trained to pay attention to things, that she was quick and thorough and unfailingly direct with her customers, and that the customers, after an initial period of adjustment, seemed to appreciate this more than they had expected to. He also noticed, though he was slower to acknowledge it, that he began timing his morning rounds slightly differently on the days he passed her street, arriving just a few minutes earlier than he needed to, slowing his pace in a way that had nothing to do with the security of Caldwell, Kansas. The first real conversation they had, the first one that wasn't strictly transactional, happened 3 weeks after her arrival, outside the Wells Hotel on a Wednesday evening. August had been returning from a meeting with the Cattle Association that had run long and accomplished little, and Nora had been coming out of the hotel dining room, having spent dinner with a widow named Edna Platt who had taken a liking to her, and invited her to supper twice a week with a warmth that had surprised Nora considerably. They nearly collided on the hotel steps. He caught her elbow to steady her. She had been looking down at a small notebook she was carrying, and she looked up sharply and then relaxed when she saw it was him. "Deputy Marshal," she said. "Miss Talbot." He released her elbow. The evening air was warm and smelled of cattle and dust and the particular dry sweetness that came off the prairie in late spring. "I apologize. I wasn't watching." "Neither was I." She looked down at the notebook and then tucked it under her arm. "Long day." "Cattle Association meeting," he said. "They want more patrols along the strip boundary. They always want more patrols than there are men to provide them. Do you tell them that? Every time." "And they say, that surely there must be a way." He said it with a dryness that surprised him. It was the kind of tone he rarely used with anyone, the kind that assumed the other person would find it funny. He was not sure why he assumed that with her. She did find it funny. "Surely there must be a way," she repeated, matching the dryness exactly. "The solution to every problem that other people have to solve." They stood on the hotel steps in the warm evening air, and for a moment neither of them spoke, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that exists between two people who are both accustomed to being alone and have therefore stopped filling quiet with noise. "How is the shop doing?" he asked. "Better than I expected," she said. "I have more work than I can complete in a standard day, which means I'll need to think about longer hours or a helper. I'm leaning toward longer hours for now. There are a few boys in town who do odd jobs," he said. "Sam Greer's youngest is 14 and reliable. He ran errands for the telegraph office for 2 years without losing a single message. I'll think about it." She looked at him with that assessing expression she had used in the marshal's office on the first day. "You know a great deal about this town. It's my job to." "Is that all it is?" He considered the question. It was more direct than most people were with him. Most people around August Wilcox maintained a certain careful distance. He was decorated, respected, and subtly unapproachable in the way that very competent, very private men often are. Nora Talbot did not appear to have received this information, or had received it and set it aside. "No," he said after a moment. "I suppose not. I care about this town. Why? It's where I chose to stay." She nodded slowly, as if this were an answer that made sense to her in a way that required thinking about. "I respect that," she said. "I didn't have a good reason to stay anywhere until now." She said it plainly, without self-pity, just as a fact being reported. "Good evening, Deputy Marshal." "Good evening, Miss Talbot." She walked down the steps and along the boardwalk toward her shop, and he watched her go for a moment before he turned and walked in the opposite direction, toward his own empty house on the northern edge of town. He lay awake longer than usual that night, not thinking about anything in particular, just lying in the darkness listening to the wind come off the prairie, and it seemed to him that the house was no quieter than it had always been, and somehow, for the first time in a long while, he was acutely aware of the fact. May moved into June, and the cattle drives intensified with the season, and Caldwell got loud and bright with the particular energy of a border town at full speed. The drovers came up from Texas with their longhorns and their wages and their appetite for any kind of pleasure that wasn't a saddle, and the saloons went full, and the streets filled with noise, and the marshal's office was busy in the way it always was in cattle season, managing the constant renegotiation between disorder and the narrow, essential rules that kept a town functional. August worked long days and sometimes longer nights. He was good at his job with the specific competence of a man who has chosen it rather than fallen into it, who has thought carefully about what it means and what it costs. He kept order not through intimidation, though he was certainly capable of it, but through a combination of absolute consistency and a particular quality of attention that made people feel, even in the midst of behaving badly, that they were being seen clearly and judged fairly. The drovers respected him. The town's permanent residents relied on him. The Cattle Association alternated between gratitude and frustration, which he had long since concluded was exactly the right relationship to have with them. Nora, in those same weeks, was building something. That was the word that kept occurring to August when he thought about her, and he thought about her more than he intended to. She was building. The shop was gaining a reputation that had spread, along the cattle trail, in the way that genuinely useful things spread, which is faster and more thoroughly than almost anything else. Drovers were coming in from Texas with orders their bosses had given them specifically for Talbot leather goods. A rancher from Sumner County had commissioned a full saddle. The Caldwell Post had written 3 lines about her in the weekly business column, and while 3 lines was not much, it was 3 more than most new businesses got in their first 2 months. She hired Sam Greer's youngest, whose name was Daniel, on a Thursday morning in mid-June. He was a quiet, serious boy with large hands and a good eye, and within a week she had taught him the fundamentals of stitching, and he was doing the simpler repair work under her supervision while she handled the custom pieces. August saw this on one of his morning passes and felt something that he could only describe as satisfaction on her behalf, which was an unusual feeling for a man who had spent several years feeling very little on anyone else's behalf at all. He went into the shop on a Friday afternoon in late June on the pretext of needing a belt repaired. It was not entirely a pretext. The belt did need work. The buckle had been wearing unevenly for a month, but he was aware that he could have dealt with it himself if he had wanted to, and that he had not wanted to. She was at the workbench at the back when he came in, bent over a length of leather with a swivel knife, her hair escaping its pins on one side, a smudge of leather dye on her left wrist. She looked up when the door opened, and the wariness that was her default expression when customers came in settled and shifted into something easier when she saw it was him. "Deputy Marshal," she said, "something I can help you with." He put the belt on the counter. "The buckle's been wearing wrong. I've left it too long." She came to the counter and picked up the belt, turning it over in her hands. She had strong hands, capable and slightly calloused, quick in the way they moved. She had, he noticed, a small scar on the base of her right thumb. "2 days," she said. "I'll put in a new rivet pattern and reset the buckle. Should last you several years if you don't leave it in water." "How much?" She named a price that was fair and slightly lower than he would have expected. And he didn't argue because he'd learned in the past weeks that she priced things carefully and with absolute precision and did not respond well to haggling. He paid, and then, because she went back to her workbench and didn't show any sign of ending the interaction, he found himself saying, "How are you settling in?" She set down the swivel knife and looked at him with the directness that he had come to think of as distinctly hers. "Honestly, yes. Better than I expected and harder than I expected, both at once." She picked up a small awl and turned it in her fingers. "The work is good. The work is very good. But there are men who come in here convinced that a woman cannot possibly know more about leather than they do, and I spend more energy than I would like on demonstrating basic competence." "Does it work, the demonstrating?" "Eventually," she said. "Some of them come around. Some of them don't come back, and that's fine too, because the ones who do come back are worth 10 of the ones who don't." "That seems like a reasonable philosophy." "I've had to be reasonable about a great many things," she said, and there was something in the way she said it, not bitterness exactly, but a kind of settled clarity about the terms of her own life that made him want to ask more. He didn't. He was not yet the kind of man with her who could ask more. "I'll come back for the belt on Monday," he said. "It'll be ready." He turned to go and then stopped at the door. He was not sure what made him say the next thing. It was not his habit to say the things that occurred to him, especially the personal ones. He had spent enough years not saying them that the reflex was very strong. "You do good work," he said. "The whole town is talking about it. I thought you should know that." He went out before she could respond, and he walked back toward the marshal's office feeling slightly off balance in a way that he recognized, distantly, as the feeling of a man who has stopped being in complete control of his own interior weather. She thought about what he had said for the rest of the afternoon, which she would not have expected. She was not, by nature, a woman who placed great stock in other people's opinions of her work. She had spent too many years in liberal Kansas, having her opinions dismissed on account of her gender to find external validation reliably available, and she had stopped looking for it and started relying instead on the quality of the work itself. But something about the way August Wilcox said things without performance, without agenda, as if the only reason to say something was because it was true, made what he said carry a different weight than most people's words. She found herself thinking about him more than was entirely convenient. He was, she had concluded, the most self-contained man she had ever encountered, and she had encountered quite a few in her 26 years. Not cold, that was the thing that kept catching her, the thing that made the self-containment interesting rather than simply off-putting. Cold men were easy to categorize and dismiss. August Wilcox was not cold. He was something more like careful. As if he had learned, somewhere along the way, that some things were worth more if you kept them well protected, and had applied that principle somewhat too broadly to his own emotional life. She had known men like that before and found them frustrating. She realized with a mild irritation at herself, not finding this one frustrating at all. On a Saturday evening in early July, the 4th of July celebration brought the whole town out into the main street, which had been roped off and strung with lanterns. There was a fiddle band and a caller and dancing, and the smell of roasting meat and wood smoke and the particular dusty sweetness of a summer crowd. Nora came with Edna Platt and found herself, after an hour, standing at the edge of the dancing with a cup of sweet cider, watching the town she had chosen turn in the warm lamplight. August appeared beside her without announcement, the way he tended to move quietly without disrupting anything. He had changed from his work clothes into a plain dark coat that fit him well, and the medals were not in evidence, which she had noticed before. He rarely wore them unless the occasion required it, unlike the men who treated their decorations as a kind of permanent weather. "Not dancing?" she asked. "Not tonight," he said. He stood beside her and watched the dancers with an expression that was pleasant but distant, and she thought about what Edna had told her the week before, how August Wilcox had lived alone for as long as anyone in Caldwell could remember, how he was respected and admired and almost pathologically unavailable in any social sense that mattered. "Tell me something about yourself," she said. "Something that isn't about the work." He looked at her. She could feel him deciding whether to feel the slight internal resistance that he seemed to have toward anything that might constitute personal disclosure, and she waited, not filling the silence with anything. "I like to read," he said finally. "In the evenings, history mostly, some philosophy. I have more books than furniture." She laughed, a real laugh, not a polite one. "More books than furniture," she said. "What does your house look like?" "Adequate," he said, and the dryness was there again, the quiet humor that surfaced occasionally like a fish coming briefly to the surface of a very still lake. "Functional. The table is good. The chairs are sound. There are bookshelves along 2 walls. No curtains," she guessed, not sure why she guessed it. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "No curtains," he confirmed. "I'll make you some," she said, and then felt immediately that it was too much, too forward, the kind of thing women said when they were angling for something, and she was not angling for anything. She was just talking. It had just come out. But he didn't look alarmed. He looked something she hadn't seen on his face before, something softer. "I wouldn't know the right color," he said. "Blue," she said. "For the kitchen, at least. Everything is better in blue." He was quiet for a moment. The fiddle played and the dancers turned and the lanterns swayed slightly in the warm evening air. "You make curtains as well as saddles?" he asked. "I make whatever needs making," she said. "It's the one useful thing my mother taught me before she died." It was more than she usually gave, that small fact about her mother, but he received it the way he received everything, carefully, without making a fuss of it. "How old were you?" he said. 12, she said. "Yours?" He looked at her again, that small surprise. 14, he said. She nodded. "Then you understand what it does to the shape of things." "Yes," he said, "just that." But the way he said it meant that he understood exactly, and she felt something settle between them, not dramatic, not momentous, just a small recognition of shared geography, the country that people who have lost things young carry inside them for the rest of their lives. They stood together at the edge of the dancing for another hour, talking in the way that people talk when they have stopped performing and started simply speaking. And August told her about Missouri and his father's farm and the cattle drives west. And she told him about Liberal and her father's leather work, which she had learned at his side from the age of 8. and how she had kept the homestead running for the last 2 years of his illness, and how, after the burial, she had stood in the doorway of the farmhouse and known with absolute certainty that staying was not the same as living. When the evening wound down and the lanterns were extinguished one by one, and the crowd dispersed into the warm dark, August walked her back to the rooming house above the general store where she had been staying since her arrival, and they stood on the steps for a moment in the quiet after the party, the town settling back into its nighttime self around them. "Thank you for the company," he said. It came out more formal than he intended, and he knew it, and he saw by her expression that she knew it too. "Thank you for talking to me," she said. "Actually talking. Do people not usually? Men in this town tend to either talk around me or through me," she said. "You talk to me." I noticed the difference. He held that for a moment. Then, "Good night, Miss Talbot. Good night, Deputy Marshal." He walked home through the empty streets and sat at his kitchen table with a book he didn't read for the better part of an hour. The summer deepened and the heat rose and the cattle trade reached its July fever, and Nora's shop was open 6 days a week and sometimes 7, and August's days were long and frequent with the particular work of keeping order in a town that never quite wanted to keep it. And yet, somehow in the spaces between, they found each other not with planning, or at least not with admitted planning, but with the kind of regularity that eventually stops being coincidence and starts being choice. Tuesday evenings, he fell into the habit of stopping by the shop just before she closed, on the stated occasion of ensuring she locked up properly, which was a job that technically required no deputy marshal at all, but which neither of them commented on. She would be finishing the last work of the day, and they would talk while she put her tools away, and he would walk out with her, and they would stand outside the locked door for a few minutes before going their separate ways. On a Wednesday morning in mid-July, she showed up at the marshal's office with a tin of food she had gotten from the hotel kitchen, saying she was passing by and thought he might not have eaten, which he hadn't. He ate at the desk while she sat in the chair across from him and told him about a dispute she'd had that morning with a drover from Texas who had accused her of overcharging him, which had been resolved when 3 other drovers who were in the shop at the time pointed out that her prices were marked clearly on a board and had not changed since she'd opened. "Did he apologize?" August asked. "After a fashion," she said. "He said he supposed she was all right for a lady shopkeeper, which I believe was the best he could manage. It probably was." She smiled at that. He was eating the biscuits she'd brought and watching her with that clear, attentive regard, and she thought, not for the first time, that the problem with August Wilcox was not that he was unreadable. He was, in fact, more readable than he intended to be if you spent enough time looking, but that he seemed to be reading himself the same careful way he read everything else, and coming to conclusions he hadn't yet decided to act on. She admitted to herself that afternoon back in the shop in something that had crept up on her while she was paying attention to other things, and had now established itself with the permanence of well-made stitching. She was 30 years away from the girl who had ever been casual about these things, and she was not about to become that girl again. She was practical and she was careful, and she had, in her life, learned the exact cost of wanting things from people who were not ready to give them. So she kept working, and she kept the Tuesday evenings and the Wednesday mornings at their pace, and she waited, which was the thing she was worst at and best at simultaneously. The thing that broke the standoff open, because that was what it was, a standoff, both of them waiting for the other to cross a line they had each drawn and had not acknowledged drawing, was a thunderstorm and a thrown horseshoe and a flooded street, and the particular way that small disasters have of collapsing the distance between people. It was the last week of July. A storm had been building over the southern plains since morning, the sky going from pale blue to yellow-gray to the dark green-gray that meant real weather, and by 4 in the afternoon it had broken open with a violence that sent every horse on Main Street into a panic. August was on the street when the worst of it hit, trying to calm a runaway gelding that had spooked at a lightning strike, and was dragging its hitching post down the middle of the road, and he got the horse calmed and tied, and was soaked through to the skin by the time the rain eased to a heavy pour. He was 2 doors from Talbot Leather Goods when a second lightning strike hit the telegraph pole on the corner and sent a burning length of wire across the boardwalk, and he dealt with that stamping it out, checking for fire, directing 2 men with buckets just to be safe. And by the time that was finished, the street was running half a foot of water and the sky had opened up again in earnest. He went into the leather shop because it was the nearest door, and she was inside alone. Daniel had gone home at noon before the storm came, and she was standing at the window watching the street with her arms crossed and an expression of focused concern that shifted immediately to something else when he came through the door. "You're soaked," she said. "Completely," he agreed. He was leaving water on her floor. He looked down at it and then up at her. "I apologize for don't," she said, and was already moving toward the back of the shop where she kept a supply cabinet, and she came back with a length of clean cotton cloth that she handed to him. It was thick and soft, the kind of cloth she used for polishing finished leather. He dried his face and his hands and she stood watching him do it, and there was something different in the air, the close, electric quality of a room where 2 people who have been maintaining careful distance are suddenly, without planning for it, very close. "Was anyone hurt?" she asked. "No. One of the geldings from the Silver Star Saloon got loose, but I got him settled." The telegraph wire came down on the corner, but there was no fire, she exhaled. "I watched the wire come down from the window. I couldn't see if you were." She stopped. She had been about to say she couldn't see if he was clear of it, but the version she had been about to say was more honest than that, and the more honest version had been, "I could not see you and I was afraid." "I'm fine," he said. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen from him before, less contained, slightly undone by something, not by the storm but by her half-finished sentence and what was in it. "Miss Talbot, Nora," she said. "It's July, August. My name is Nora." He was quiet for one long moment, and the rain hammered against the windows and the thunder moved off to the east, and they were standing close enough that she could see the water still in his hair, and the way his jaw had set with the particular tension of a man trying very hard to continue doing the wrong thing and losing the argument with himself about it. "Nora," he said. And then, because it was the most honest thing available to him, and he had, in the past several weeks, been slowly losing his capacity to be anything other than honest with her, "I have spent a considerable amount of effort this summer pretending that I don't think about you constantly." She looked at him. "How is that going?" "Not well," he said. She laughed, that real laugh, the one that happened when something genuinely surprised her. And then she closed the small remaining distance between them and put her hand flat on the front of his wet coat, and he looked down at it and then at her face, and he lifted his hand and put it over hers, both of them still for a moment in the drumming rain, and then he bent his head and kissed her. It was not a tentative kiss. It was the kiss of a man who, having finally decided to do something, does it with the same full attention he brings to everything else slow and certain, and with the quality of something that has been waiting a long time to become itself. She kissed him back with equal measure, her hand curling in the wet fabric of his coat, and outside the thunder moved further east, and the rain settled from a roar to a steady pour. And inside the shop everything was still except for the 2 of them finding their way, finally, to the right side of the distance they had been keeping. When they broke apart she was slightly out of breath, and he looked, for the first time since she had known him, like a man who had allowed something through the wall he kept around himself and was not sure what to do next. "You could have done that a month ago," she said. "I know," he said. "Why didn't you?" He thought about it honestly. "Because I wasn't sure you would want me to. And because I was afraid that if it went wrong I would have to go back to the way things were before you got here, and I have discovered I am significantly less prepared to do that than I was before." She looked at him for a long moment. "August," she said. "I rode 11 days alone on a Kansas prairie to get here. I am not a woman who turns back easily." The smile that crossed his face then, the full version, The one she had only seen in brief fragments before was something she decided she would need to see again as often as possible. It changed his whole face, took 10 years off the careful gravity of it, showed the man underneath the marshal, the one who had grown up on a Missouri farm and read history books and never hung curtains. "No," he said. "You are not." August and Nora moved carefully into the territory of something real, which is different from and considerably more complex than the territory of something wanted. They were both 30 years old in their interior lives, even if the calendar said 32 and 26, and they had each lived long enough with independence that the renegotiation of self that love requires is never as simple as it looks from the outside. He came to the shop more openly now, and she stopped by the marshal's office on mornings when she was passing, and there were evenings when they sat on the bench outside the hotel after dinner with Edna Platt and talked until the street went quiet. And there were other evenings when he came by the shop after closing, and she made coffee on the small stove in the back room, and they sat together among the smell of leather and linseed oil and talked about books and history and the shape of the West, and what they each thought their lives were supposed to become. He told her about the loneliness, eventually. Not all at once. He was not a man built for that kind of disclosure, and she didn't need him to be. But piece by piece, the way a skilled craftsman works, he let her see the parts of it that had been invisible to the rest of Caldwell, Kansas, for the better part of a decade. The emptiness of the house. The way the metals had started to feel like a substitute for something rather than a marker of something. The particular quality of being admired from a distance by everyone and known closely by no one. She listened with the patience she had learned from years of careful work, and she didn't try to fix any of it or rush past it, and he found, gradually, that the telling of it made it something different, not smaller exactly, but less total. Like a room that has been closed too long and finally gets a window opened. She told him things too, about the years after her mother died, keeping house for her father while her father's grief went on and she was still a child. About the work she had turned to as the one thing that couldn't leave or change or break her heart. About the specific kind of loneliness of a woman who is capable and competent and has no one to give that capability to except herself. "You know what I missed most," she said one evening, sitting on the bench outside the hotel with the sun going down behind the plains in shades of orange and rose. "Cooking for someone, not because I like cooking particularly, but because cooking for yourself is just maintenance. Cooking for someone else means they're there to be cooked for." He was quiet for a moment. "Then I've been eating at the hotel dining room for 2 years. "I know," she said. "Edna told me. Edna tells you a great deal." "Edna tells me everything," she said. "She is the most reliably informative person in this town." He looked at her sideways. "What else has she told you?" "That you gave the Turner family your firewood last January when their supply ran out and never mentioned it to anyone. That you check on Mrs. Hendricks every Sunday because her son is in Colorado and she has no one else. That you have never, in 2 years of hotel dinners, failed to say please and thank you to the kitchen staff." She paused. "She is very fond of you for what it's worth." He said nothing. He was looking at the sunset with that expression she had come to recognize as the one where he was feeling something and was working out whether he was going to let it land or deflect it. "I'm very fond of you," she said. Quietly, without drama, the way she said true things. He turned to look at her. The last of the sunset light was in her hair and on the side of her face, and she looked back at him steadily with those hazel eyes that went gold in the evening light, and whatever he had been working out in the private mathematics of his interior life, it seemed to resolve itself. "I love you," he said. Came out with the simple directness of a man who has finally stopped arguing with himself. "I realize that may be sooner than expected, and I realize I should probably—" "August," she said. "Yes. I love you too," he exhaled. She watched the tension leave his shoulders, something she had not quite seen happen before, as if he had been carrying a weight for a long time that had finally been lifted by the simplest possible means. "All right," he said, as if something had been settled. "All right," she agreed. He reached over and took her hand, and they sat together as the last of the daylight went out of the sky, and the stars came out over the Kansas prairie, thick and close and brilliant, and the town settled into its evening sounds around them. The difficulties, because there are always difficulties, arrived in August. The month, not the man with the news that the county commissioners were considering restructuring the marshal's district, which would require the deputy marshal position to be reviewed and potentially consolidated with the Wichita office. It was political and complicated, and had to do with money and railroad land grants, and the particular kind of maneuvering that went on in county government, and August handled it with the same steady competence he brought to everything, but Nora could see, in the evenings, that it was wearing at him. There was also the matter of a man named Cutter Dean. Cutter Dean was a drover who had come up from Texas with a crew in early August and had developed, over the course of 2 visits to the leather shop, an opinion of Nora that she had made clear was unwanted, and that he had declined to respect in the way that certain types of men decline to respect clear signals from women. He was not violent, not quite, not yet, but he was persistent and loud and had a way of leaning in the doorway of her shop and making comments that made the other customers uncomfortable and made Daniel, who was still 14, go stiff with a young man's furious helplessness. She had told him once directly to leave her shop. He had laughed it off. She had told him twice. He had told her she'd feel differently by the weekend. When August found out, not from her, but from Edna, who had been in the shop the second time and had gone directly to the marshal's office with the information, his response was measured and immediate and, in its way, very revealing of his character. He went to the Silver Star Saloon where Dean and his crew were drinking, and he sat down across from Dean without invitation and spoke to him quietly and without any particular display of force. Nora, who heard the account from 2 separate witnesses later, was told that August had laid out the situation with a precision that left no room for interpretation. Dean was welcome in Caldwell so long as he conducted himself appropriately, and that did not include any further contact with Miss Talbot. And if there was a third incident, she would press formal charges, and he, August Wilcox, would personally see to it that the process was completed before Dean had the opportunity to ride back to Texas. Dean had apparently started to object, and August had said something quiet that no one was close enough to hear, and after that Dean had finished his drink and told his crew they were heading out in the morning. He left the next day. No third incident. Nora heard all of this and went to the marshal's office on the morning after Dean's departure and found August at his desk writing a report and did not say anything for a moment, just stood in the doorway looking at him. He looked up. "Edna told you," he said. "Edna tells me everything," she confirmed. "You should have let me handle it." "You were handling it," he said. He wasn't listening. Sometimes that's when the office needs to get involved. She considered this. She had opinions about men handling things on her behalf, several of which were sharp and well-founded and had been earned over years of having men decide things for her without asking. She held all of those opinions up to the light for a moment and looked at them carefully. "You didn't make a scene," she said. "No. You didn't perform anything. You just went and dealt with it and came back. That's the job," he said. "No," she said. "The job is to keep order in the town. That was something else." He looked at her steadily. "Yes," he said, "it was." She came into the office and sat down in the chair across from his desk and folded her hands in her lap and looked at him with the clarity that was, she had come to understand, one of the things he valued most about her, the fact that she did not pretend and did not require pretending. "Thank you," she said, "but if something like that happens again, I want to know before you go." "Agreed," he said without argument, "and I am fully capable of pressing charges myself." "I know you are." "I was going to suggest it was an option." He left before it became necessary. She held his gaze, he held hers. The morning light came through the small window of the marshal's office and caught the silver of the deputy's badge on his coat, and she thought, not for the first time, about the particular weight of being the most decorated man in a county and what it cost and what it was worth. "Are you all right?" she asked. "About the commission review." Something in his expression shifted. He was always slightly surprised when she asked about him rather than simply about the situation. "It's uncertain," he said. "The post may consolidate by spring. I'd need to decide whether to apply for the full marshal's position in Wichita or consider something else." "Something like what?" He was quiet for a moment. "I own land," he said, "north of town, 160 acres. I haven't done anything with it." She looked at him. He was looking at the surface of his desk in the way he sometimes did when he was thinking about something more specific than the words suggested. "How much of your life do you want to keep living in this office?" she asked. "I have been asking myself that question considerably more than I used to," he said. And he looked up and met her eyes, and in his expression was the answer to about 5 questions she had not quite asked yet. On a clear evening in late September, with the heat broken and the first cool edge of autumn coming off the prairie, August Wilcox took Nora Talbot out to the land north of town. He had a rig for the occasion, the chestnut mare borrowed from the livery, not her chestnut, which was a different animal, but a similar one that he had noted she found reliable and liked, and they drove out in the blue early evening through the tall grass that was going gold with the season. The land was flat and wide and quiet, the way Kansas land is quiet with the total, encompassing silence of a place that has never been crowded, that has room for everything it contains. There was a creek running through the eastern edge of it, and a low rise on the northern boundary that caught the evening light perfectly, and standing on that rise you could see for what felt like the length of the world in every direction. They stood on the rise together and looked at it, the land that was his and had been sitting unused while he had been living in his narrow, neat, curtainless house, and she could feel him deciding something, could feel the tremor of it in the way he stood. "I bought it 4 years ago," he said. "I'm not sure what I was thinking. I think I was thinking I might eventually have a reason to use it." She looked out at the grass and the creek and the evening sky going pink and gold at the horizon. She thought about what a house here would look like. She thought about what a shop would look like, further back in town, with curtains on the windows and a sign that had been repainted. She thought about bookshelves along 2 walls and a kitchen table that needed more than one chair. "It's beautiful," she said. "I thought so too," he said. "The first time I saw it." He turned to face her. The wind was in her hair, and the evening light was on her face, and he was, she could see, afraid in the specific way of a man who has been self-sufficient for so long that asking for anything feels like an act of dangerous exposure. He reached into his coat pocket and took out a small ring, plain silver, simply made, the kind of thing a man buys when he knows exactly what he wants and has no interest in performance. "I know you are not a woman who does things because they are expected," he said. "I know you have built something that is yours and that you are right to be proud of it. I am not asking you to change any of that. I am asking if you would be willing to build something with me, here, if that is something you would want." She looked at the ring in his hand and then at his face and then at the land stretching out around them in the evening light. "There would need to be curtains," she said. "Blue," he said immediately. "You told me, kitchen at least," she laughed. The laugh that happened when something genuinely, completely surprised her with its rightness. "Yes," she said. "August, yes." He put the ring on her finger and she looked at it and then at him, and he held her face in his hands and kissed her there on the rise of land above the creek, with the autumn wind moving through the grass and the whole of the prairie going golden around them. And she thought this was, without question, the furthest and the best she had ever traveled. They were married in November of 1882, on a Saturday morning at the Methodist Church on 4th Street, with Edna Platt crying happily in the front row, and Daniel Greer standing very straight in his good coat, and the entirety of Caldwell, Kansas, turning out in the cold, clear morning, with the enthusiasm of people who have been waiting for something to go right for a long time. Nora wore a dress she had made herself in the weeks before, deep blue wool, well cut, practical enough to be comfortable and beautiful enough to be exactly right. She carried no flowers. She walked herself down the aisle with a composure that made several women in the congregation cry for reasons they would have had difficulty explaining. August stood at the front of the church in his best coat with the medals conspicuously absent, and when she came up beside him and he turned to look at her, the expression on his face was the one that Edna Platt described afterward to everyone she knew for the next 6 months as the most purely happy thing she had ever seen on a human being. The minister asked them to repeat their vows, and they did, clearly and without stumbling. And when he asked if anyone had objection, Willis Drummond called out, "We'd better not have any objections or half this town is out of work," which produced laughter that was still going when the minister pronounced them married. They had a simple celebration at the Wells Hotel, with the fiddle band from the 4th of July, and a great deal of food that the hotel kitchen had spent 2 days preparing. And August danced with his wife with a willingness and ease that surprised everyone who had expected him to manage his own wedding with the same grave competence with which he managed everything else. He could dance. He had apparently always been able to dance. He had simply not had sufficient reason to. Construction on the house north of town began in the spring of 1883. In the weeks after the county commission had resolved, through a combination of August's own lobbying and considerable political pressure from the Caldwell business community, who had written a joint letter to the commissioners outlining exactly what the town would lose if the deputy marshal position was consolidated, to retain the position independently. He would keep his post under a slightly expanded jurisdiction, and the question of Wichita had receded. The house went up quickly because August was organized, and the contractors he hired were good, and because Nora, who had opinions about everything from the placement of the kitchen windows to the pitch of the roof, was involved in every decision with a precision that the contractors initially found startling and eventually found invaluable. The bookshelves went along the wall of the study. The kitchen table was large enough for 6. The curtains she made herself over 3 evenings in February, and they were blue, a medium clear blue that caught the winter light and, she was privately certain, changed the entire quality of the room. He stood in the kitchen doorway the first morning the curtains were hung and looked at them for a long moment, and she watched him from the table where she was drinking coffee. "Better," she said. "Much better," he said. And he sat down across from her at the kitchen table that had never in his previous life held more than 1 plate, and she poured coffee into his cup, and they sat together in the blue-curtained kitchen of their house on the Kansas prairie as the morning light came in, and it was, he thought, the simplest and the most complete thing he had ever known. The leather shop stayed open. This had never been in question. Nora had not married August with any intention of closing Talbot Leather Goods, and he had not asked her to. She rode into town 4 days a week in the good weather and 3 in the winter, on her chestnut mare, and Daniel Greer, who was 15 by now and considerably more skilled with leather than the average apprentice, managed the shop on the days she was not there with a reliability that made it possible. She took on an increasing number of custom saddle commissions, and by the end of 1883, Talbot Leather Goods had a reputation that extended well beyond Caldwell into the broader cattle country, and orders came in from ranchers in Texas and Colorado who had heard about the quality of her work from drovers on the trail. August continued his work, and the expanded jurisdiction gave him new problems to think about and new relationships to build, with the Indian Agency on the border of the Cherokee Strip, with the railroad men who were increasingly present in Sumner County, with the complicated and often contentious business of a town that was growing faster than its infrastructure. He was good at it, and he knew it, and the work satisfied him in the way it always had, only now it was different because now he came home. Coming home was something he had not known how to do before she arrived. He thought about this sometimes on the evening ride back from town, the horse finding its own way along the familiar trail while the sun went down behind the plains. He thought about the year before she had come, the decorated, respected, hollow life of a man who had been praised publicly and known by no one. And he thought about the morning she had walked into his office with dirt on her boots and a reference letter from Meade County, and had looked at him with the directness of a woman who had no patience left for anything that wasn't real. And he understood, in a way that he could not have articulated to anyone but her, that she had not come to Caldwell to find him. She had come to Caldwell to build a life. And in building it she had, without either of them intending it, dismantled the wall he had been living behind and replaced it with something better, with a house, with blue curtains, with a kitchen table that held 2 cups. In the winter of 1883, Nora told him she was expecting. She told him in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning before either of them had gone anywhere, sitting across from him at the table with her coffee, and she said it directly in the way she said everything, without performance or circling. He looked at her for a long moment. She watched him process it, watched the thing move through him, and then he stood up from the table and came around to her side and crouched down beside her chair and took both her hands in his and looked up at her. "Are you well?" he asked, because that was August. The first question was always about her. "Very well," she said. "The doctor says everything is exactly as it should be." He held her hands, and she could feel him searching for words that were large enough and couldn't find them, which she had come to understand was its own kind of eloquence. "I know you're happy," she said. "You don't need to find the sentence." He pressed her hands to his face and held them there, and she put her fingers in his hair and held on. Their son was born in August of 1884, which August Wilcox found quietly and privately hilarious in a way that he expressed with the contained humor she had come to love. They named him Thomas James Wilcox, after his paternal grandfather and her father, and he arrived into the world with his mother's hazel eyes and a substantial pair of lungs that indicated he had no intentions of going unnoticed. Edna Platt was at the house within the hour and stayed for 4 days, managing the domestic details with a brisk competence that left Nora free to recover and August free to learn how to hold a baby, which he approached with the same focused, methodical attention he brought to everything else, and which, she noted from the bed, he mastered considerably faster than most men were reputed to. He sat with Thomas in the chair by the window of their bedroom on the second morning, the baby asleep against his chest, and Nora watched them from the bed, the large, careful man, and the new, small life he was holding as if it were the most important thing he had ever been trusted with. And she thought about the house on the edge of town that had had no curtains and 1 plate, and the man who had ridden back into Caldwell with his medals and his loneliness. And she felt something so full it was almost difficult to breathe around. He looked up and found her watching him. "He's very small," he said, with an expression of concentrated wonder. "All of them are at first," she said. "I know that theoretically." He looked back down at Thomas. "It's different in practice." "Most things are," she said. He smiled, the full version, the one she had been collecting since that evening in the thunderstorm. "Yes," he said, "they are." The years after Thomas's birth settled into a life that was full in the way that lives built honestly and on purpose are full, not easy, not without friction or difficulty or the ordinary reversals that any living involves, but full, complete, held together by the right things. August continued his work as deputy marshal through 1885, by which point the cattle drives through Caldwell were beginning to diminish as the railheads pushed further south and west, and the character of the town was shifting from frontier cattle post to more settled agricultural community. He could feel the change in the air, in the nature of the disputes he was called to manage, in the conversations at the marshal's office, and he thought carefully about what it meant for the next phase of his life. He resigned the position in the spring of 1886, after 8 years of service, with the full endorsement of the town council, and a farewell gathering at the Wells Hotel that filled the dining room to capacity. He was given a commendation by the new county sheriff, which he accepted with the same quiet gravity with which he accepted everything, and he shook hands with men he had worked with for a decade, and he came home in the evening to find Nora waiting on the porch of their house with Thomas on her hip and the prairie going gold behind her in the evening light. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Like a man who is about to start something new," he said. He had been working the land for 2 years already, with help from a neighboring family named Garcia, Eduardo and Maria Garcia, who farmed 50 acres to the east with their 3 children, whom Thomas had come to regard as an extended family, and who had been invaluable in teaching August the particular requirements of farming Kansas soil, which was different in several key ways from the Missouri farming of his childhood. He had cattle, a small herd, not the ranching scale of the big operators but enough to be profitable, and he had crops, and he had plans for more, and he had Nora, who had opinions about every aspect of the farm operation that were invariably correct. Talbot leather goods underwent its own evolution in those years. In 1886, with Daniel Greer now 18 and fully trained, Nora took him on as a formal partner, a decision that caused some consternation among the more traditional-minded businessmen of Caldwell, but was treated by the business community generally with the pragmatic acceptance of people who could see that the arrangement made the shop more profitable. Daniel Greer had a genius for the structural side of saddle making that complemented Nora's precision with custom work, and together they expanded the shop's output to include a catalog of standard goods that sold to hardware and farm supply stores as far east as Topeka. She still made everything with her own hands when it mattered. The custom pieces, the commissioned saddles, the special order bridles, the worked leather goods that people asked for by name, those were still entirely hers, and her reputation for them was, by 1887, something that people in the cattle trade spoke about as a matter of course, the way they spoke about good horses or reliable weather. In the autumn of 1886, she found out she was expecting again. She told August in the kitchen again on a Tuesday morning, and this time he did not need to search for words. He stood up, came around the table, and kissed her thoroughly and without any of the restraint that had once characterized everything about him, and then held her face in his hands and looked at her with an expression so full of love it was almost difficult to look at directly. "Good," he said. "Extremely good," she agreed. Their second child, born in May of 1887, was a girl. They named her Clara Rose Wilcox Clara for no reason, except that Nora had always thought it was the name that suited a quiet strength, and Rose because August, to his own slight surprise, simply liked it. She arrived on a Sunday morning in the spring with considerably more speed and far less drama than Thomas had, and Thomas, who was nearly 3, spent the first several days of his sister's life studying her with the grave, focused intensity of a child who has not yet decided whether this new development is acceptable. By the end of the week, he had decided it was. He could be found, thereafter, in the precise vicinity of his sister, whenever she was in a room, with the protective alertness of a child who has identified something important to look after, and which Nora thought was the most August thing that a 3-year-old had ever done. August, when she said this to him, looked at his son and then at her and said, "I can think of worse things to inherit," and she thought that was, in its quiet way, one of the most beautiful things he had ever said. The house filled with the ordinary beautiful noise of 2 children and 2 people who had chosen each other with full knowledge of what choosing meant. There were difficult seasons. The drought of 1887 that pushed the cattle herd and the crops both into crisis, and required the kind of partnership that strips away everything except what is genuinely solid and good. They worked through it together with Eduardo Garcia and his family, with the particular grit of people who have built something and intend to keep it. The herd reduced. The crop diversified. The leather shop, which was not dependent on rain, held stable and contributed significantly during the hard months, which Nora managed without ever once suggesting that she had been right to keep it, because she had never needed to be right in that way. There was a period in the winter of that drought year when the weight of it sat on August in the way that hard things sometimes sat on him. Not crushing, but heavy, the old self-contained solitude pulling at him in the way it did when he was under pressure. She watched it without alarm and without trying to immediately fix it, because she had come to understand the difference between the August who needed space to think and the August who needed to be reached. One evening she put Thomas and Clara to bed and came to the study where he was sitting with a book he wasn't reading, and she sat in the chair across from him and said, "Tell me what you're carrying." He looked up. "You go quiet when it gets heavy," she said, "and I can manage quiet, but not if you're going quietly through something I should know about." He set the book down. The fire was low and the study smelled of wood smoke and leather and the particular smell of his books, and he looked at her in the firelight and said, "I'm afraid of not being enough, for all of it, for you, for them, for the land." She held that for a moment. Then, "You know what the difference is between you and the men who don't say that." "What?" "You say it." He looked at her steadily. She leaned forward in her chair and put her hand out across the small table between them, and he took it. "You are enough," she said. "You are considerably more than enough, and I have been trying to tell you that for 5 years, and I am going to keep trying for however many more it takes." He held her hand with both of his and said nothing for a long moment. The fire popped and settled. Outside the window the winter prairie was silent and vast. "I know it," he said at last. "When you're in the room, I know it." "Then I'll stay in the room," she said. The drought broke in the spring of 1888. And the land recovered with the particular resilience that Kansas land had. The grass came back. The creek ran full again. The cattle that had been reduced to a manageable 15 head were supplemented by a new purchase from a rancher in Sumner County who was scaling down. And by the end of summer the farm was, if not exactly thriving, then solidly and dependably growing again. August planted an orchard that year, apple trees, 10 of them, along the eastern edge of the property near the creek. It was a long-term proposition. He said so himself, said that apple trees took years to produce fruit, and he was planting them now so Thomas and Clara would grow up with them. Nora watched him plant the first one, serious and careful, in the way he was serious and careful about everything, pressing the soil around the roots with the same deliberate attention he had once brought to law enforcement. And she thought that this was the most complete picture she had ever had of who he was. A man who thought in years, who planned for things he might not immediately see, who had spent decades waiting for something worth tending and had now found it and would tend it with everything he had. She brought him water and stood beside him in the warm spring afternoon, and he took the water and drank and looked out at the row of small trees he had planted and said, "What do you think?" "I think you're a man who plants things," she said. He looked at her with a slight smile. "Is that good?" "August," she said, "it is the best thing I know about you, and I know a great deal of very good things about you." He put his arm around her and she leaned into his side, and they stood together in the warm afternoon looking at the orchard he had planted. And somewhere in the house behind them, Thomas was running in the way that 4-year-old boys run, which is to say with no regard for anything in his path. And Clara was laughing in her crib in the room off the kitchen. And the prairie went on in every direction, wide and gold and full of everything. The years continued, as years do, moving with the pace that years have when they are full of things worth doing and people worth loving, which is both faster and richer than most people expect until they are living them. Thomas grew into a serious, focused child with a gift for mechanical thinking that expressed itself first in the taking apart, and, eventually, the putting back together of every piece of farm equipment on the property, which August responded to with a patience that Nora found privately admirable given the number of times the plow harness had been disassembled and left in pieces. Clara grew into a child with her mother's directness and her father's capacity for stillness, and an instinctive skill with the horses that she had demonstrated by the age of 4 and which, by 6, had made her the undisputed manager of the stable. The apple trees grew. Slowly and then less slowly, the way living things grow almost invisibly for a long stretch, and then suddenly visible in their progress. By 1891, the first three were producing fruit, small and slightly tart, and Thomas and Clara ate them from the branches with the satisfaction of children who have watched something come to be over the long seasons of their lives. August stood in the orchard one autumn evening, with Nora beside him, and they looked at the trees that had been saplings 3 years ago, and he thought about the man he had been before she came, the decorated, solitary, relentlessly competent man who had stood in his curtainless house and told himself it was enough. "What are you thinking?" she asked. She always knew when he was thinking something specific. "I'm thinking about before," he said. "Before me, before you." He looked at her. The evening was cool and the apple smell was everywhere, and her hair was coming down on one side the way it always did by this hour, the same way it had been coming down on the day she had first walked into his office with her reference letter and her road-dusty boots. "I don't recognize him. The man before." "Yes." She considered this. "I do," she said. "I saw him. He was the same man. He was just waiting." "Waiting for what?" She smiled, the small, genuine one, the one that had never been rehearsed. "For someone to come in and open a window," she said. He looked at her for a long moment in the autumn orchard, and then he put his hand to the side of her face, and she turned her cheek into his palm the way she had learned to, the way you learn the particular gestures of someone you love so deeply that the body memorizes them without being told. "You changed everything," he said. "You let me," she said. "That was the harder part." He kissed her there in the orchard with the apple trees around them, and the evening coming down over the Kansas prairie. And it was not the dramatic, storm-caught kiss of that thunderstruck afternoon in the leather shop, but something quieter and more permanent. The kiss of people who know what they have and have decided, every day for nearly a decade now, to keep it. Nora Talbot Wilcox was 34 years old, standing in her orchard in the autumn of 1890, and she had the shop and the farm and the children and the man, and she had built every part of it with her own hands and her own determination, and the particular clear-eyed courage of a woman who had learned early that nothing good comes without effort, and had decided that the effort was worth it. In the spring of 1892, a letter came from August's brother Elias in California, not one of the distant, cheerful postcards, but a real letter, 4 pages long, saying that he had married a woman named Frances and they had a daughter, and that he had been thinking about coming east, about whether there was something in Kansas worth returning to, about whether the brother he had been writing distantly at for a decade might have something to say to him. August wrote back that same evening, not at his desk in the study, but at the kitchen table, with Nora sitting across from him working on a piece of leather work by the lamplight, the children asleep, the house full of the warm domestic quiet of an ordinary evening that contained everything. He wrote 4 pages. He told Elias about the farm and the orchard and the children and the work. He told him about Nora, about the day she had come in with the road dust on her boots and the reference letter, about the thunderstorm and the leather shop, about the night on the rise above the creek when he had given her the ring with hands that weren't entirely steady. He told him that he had been, for a long time, the most decorated man in the county and almost certainly the most alone, and that both of those things had been true until a woman from Liberal, Kansas, had ridden into Caldwell on a chestnut mare and started taking her world apart and putting it back together better. He told Elias that the spare room in the house was large and well lit, that Thomas would be delighted by a cousin, and that Frances was welcome for as long as they wanted to stay. He signed the letter, folded it, and looked up to find Nora watching him with her work in her hands and the lamplight warm on her face. "Is it a good letter?" she asked. "I think so," he said. "Tell me." He read it to her, all 4 pages, and she listened with her hands still and her eyes on him, and when he finished she said nothing for a moment. "You told him about the boots," she said. "I told him about the boots," he confirmed. She smiled. "I should have cleaned them before I came in." "No," he said, "you shouldn't have." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, and he turned his hand and held hers, and the lamp burned between them, and the house was quiet and full and good. And through the kitchen window, the Kansas night was enormous and full of stars, the kind of stars that only exist when you are far enough from everything to see them clearly. Elias wrote back in June to say he and Frances and little Margaret would come in the fall, and they did, arriving on the Santa Fe Railway in October with a trunk and a crate and a small, serious baby, who immediately enchanted Thomas and Clara, and who Nora held for the better part of the first evening, while Elias and August sat at the kitchen table and talked the way brothers talk when they have been apart too long and are finding their way back. She watched August that evening from her chair by the fire, watched him talk and laugh, the ease of it, the way his whole face was open in a way that she knew it had not always been, and she thought about the weight of all those years of medals and silence, and about the particular grace of a life that had been allowed, at last, to become what it was supposed to be. The farm grew. The orchard bore fruit every autumn. Thomas turned 12 and could fix anything with a gear or a spring, and Clara turned 10 and ran the stable better than anyone twice her age, and August Wilcox rode out across his land in the mornings, with the settled satisfaction of a man who has found the right use for everything he has, including himself, and Nora Talbot kept her leather shop and her reputation and her marriage with the same clear-eyed competence she had always brought to everything. And every Tuesday she rode the chestnut mare into Caldwell and came back in the late afternoon with the road dust on her boots and the smell of good leather work on her hands, and August would meet her at the barn and take the mare's reins. And she would step down from the rig, and he would put his arm around her, and they would walk up to the house together through the grass, and it was such a simple thing, such an entirely simple and complete thing, and he had spent so many years of his life without it. He said that the simplest things were the ones he had least expected. She looked at him with those hazel eyes that had gone gold in the afternoon light and said, "The best things always come in on dusty boots, August. You just have to know to open the door." He looked at her, the woman who had ridden alone across 11 days of Kansas prairie to build something from nothing, who had walked into his office and changed everything without for a moment intending to, who had brought blue curtains and a full kitchen table and a love so honest and complete that it had made the loneliness seem, in retrospect, like a room he had been living in that he had simply forgotten to leave. "Lucky for me," he said. "I happened to be inside." She took his hand. The prairie went on around them, wide and gold and without end, and the house was full of light, and the apples were coming ripe on the trees by the creek, and the life they had built stood solid and whole and entirely their own in the long Kansas afternoon. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.